Sarah Martinez never imagined her humanitarian mission would turn into a fight for survival. The 28-year-old nurse from Phoenix had volunteered with the International Medical Relief Organization, driven by a deep desire to help civilians caught in the crossfire of the Iraq War. Her colleagues often joked about her fearless nature, but Sarah knew fear. She simply chose to push through it. The convoy carrying medical supplies rolled through the dusty streets of Fallujah on a scorching Tuesday morning in 2004. Sarah sat in the second vehicle, reviewing patient files from the makeshift clinic they had established near the city center. The sound of distant gunfire had become background noise over the past 3 weeks, as common as the call to prayer that echoed across the city 5 times daily. Her translator, Ahmad, pointed out landmarks as they passed. He had become more than just a language bridge. He was her window into understanding the local culture and the complex web of alliances that shifted daily in this war-torn city. Ahmad had 3 children and spoke often about his dream of opening a small shop once peace returned to Fallujah. The medical team had been making remarkable progress. They had treated over 200 patients in the past month, ranging from combat injuries to basic healthcare needs that had gone unmet for months. Sarah had delivered 2 babies, helped reset countless broken bones, and provided vaccinations that could save entire families from preventable diseases. The morning started like any other, with the team preparing to visit a neighborhood where reports indicated several families were trapped in their homes, too afraid to seek medical help. The area had seen heavy fighting the previous week, and civilian casualties were mounting. Sarah had convinced the team leader, Dr. James Morrison, that they needed to reach these families before their conditions became critical. As their convoy approached the target neighborhood, Sarah noticed the unusual silence. No children played in the streets, no vendors called out their wares, and even the ever-present stray dogs seemed to have vanished. Ahmad shifted nervously in his seat, his eyes constantly scanning the windows of the surrounding buildings. The first shot shattered the windshield of the lead vehicle. Within seconds, the peaceful morning erupted into chaos as automatic weapons fire rained down from multiple directions. Sarah dove to the floor of the vehicle as bullets punched through the thin metal walls around her. The driver, a local man named Hassan, slumped forward, blood spreading across his white shirt. Ahmad grabbed the steering wheel, trying to navigate the vehicle to safety while staying low. Sarah could hear Dr. Morrison shouting orders over the radio, but the static and gunfire made his words nearly impossible to understand. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as she realized they had driven straight into a carefully planned ambush. The vehicle lurched violently as Ahmad tried to reverse, but their escape route was blocked by armed men who had emerged from the buildings around them. Sarah felt a sharp burning sensation in her shoulder as a bullet found its mark. The world began to blur as shock set in, but her medical training kicked in automatically. She pressed her hand against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding while staying conscious. Through the broken windows, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions. The attackers had chosen their location perfectly. A narrow street with high walls on both sides, creating a deadly funnel with no escape routes. Sarah realized with growing horror that this was not a random attack but a carefully orchestrated trap designed to capture or kill the medical team. The shooting continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Sarah felt another sharp pain as a second bullet struck her leg, and then a third that grazed her head, sending warm blood trickling down her face. Ahmad was no longer moving, and she could not tell if he was unconscious or worse. The radio had gone silent, and the only sounds were the continuing gunfire and her own labored breathing. As darkness began to creep in around the edges of her vision, Sarah thought about her family back in Phoenix. Her mother had begged her not to come to Iraq, warning that the danger was too great. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had understood her need to serve but had made her promise to be careful. Now lying wounded in a blood-soaked vehicle in the middle of Fallujah, she wondered if she would ever see them again. The gunfire gradually subsided, replaced by voices speaking in rapid Arabic. Sarah could hear footsteps approaching the vehicle, boots crunching on broken glass and debris. She closed her eyes and tried to control her breathing, hoping that whoever found her would believe she was already dead. The next few moments would determine whether she lived to continue her mission or became another casualty in a war that seemed to have no end in sight. The voices grew closer, and Sarah could distinguish at least 3 different men speaking in hushed but urgent tones. Through her partially closed eyelids, she watched as shadows moved around the destroyed convoy. Her heart hammered against her ribs so loudly she feared they would hear it. But she forced herself to remain completely still, even as blood continued to seep from her wounds. One of the men yanked open the door of her vehicle, causing her to slide slightly toward the opening. She felt rough hands checking for signs of life among her companions. Ahmad groaned softly, confirming he was alive but badly injured. The man searching their vehicle called out to his associates, and Sarah heard heated discussion about what to do with any survivors. From what little Arabic she had learned during her time in Iraq, Sarah understood that some wanted to leave immediately while others argued for taking prisoners. The debate seemed to center around whether the approaching sound of distant helicopters indicated an imminent rescue operation or simply routine patrols. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited to learn her fate. The decision was made quickly. Strong arms pulled Sarah from the vehicle, and despite her efforts to appear unconscious, a sharp slap across her face made it clear they knew she was alive. When she reluctantly opened her eyes, she found herself staring at a bearded man in his 30s, wearing a mixture of military and civilian clothing. His expression was difficult to read, but his eyes held the hardened look of someone who had seen too much violence. Through broken English mixed with Arabic, he explained that she and Ahmad were now prisoners. The rest of her medical team had either escaped in the lead vehicle or were dead. She could not tell which from his words. They were going to be moved to a safer location before American forces arrived to investigate the attack. Sarah's medical bag was searched, and surprisingly, her captors seemed pleased to discover her medical supplies and credentials. The journey through Fallujah's backstreets was a nightmare of pain and terror. Sarah was forced to walk despite her leg wound, with Ahmad leaning heavily on her for support. Every step sent sharp jolts of agony through her body, but the alternative, being dragged or shot for moving too slowly, kept her moving forward. The city around them showed the scars of constant warfare. Buildings with gaping holes, streets littered with debris, and the acrid smell of smoke and cordite hanging in the air. They stopped at a damaged house where several other armed men waited. Sarah was horrified to realize this was clearly a planned operation with multiple participants and safe houses already prepared. The level of organization suggested this was not simply an opportunistic attack but part of a larger strategy to target international aid workers and discourage humanitarian missions in the area. The house they entered had been a family home before the war, evidenced by children's toys scattered in corners and family photographs still hanging on partially destroyed walls. Sarah wondered what had happened to the family who once lived here and whether they had escaped or become victims of the violence that had consumed their city. Her captors spoke among themselves while periodically glancing at their prisoners. Sarah caught fragments of conversation that suggested they were waiting for instructions from someone higher up in their organization. Meanwhile, her wounds continued to bleed and she began to feel lightheaded from blood loss. When she asked for water, one of the men grudgingly provided a small cup, but medical attention for her wounds was denied. Ahmad whispered to her in English that he had overheard discussions about using them as bargaining chips in negotiations with American forces. However, he also warned that some of the men seemed to favor simply executing them to avoid the complications that prisoners could create. The political situation in Fallujah was fluid, and their value as hostages could change rapidly, depending on military developments. As night fell, Sarah was moved to a small room in the back of the house where she was given a thin blanket and told to rest. The pain from her wounds made sleep impossible, but she used the quiet time to assess her injuries more carefully. The shoulder wound was the most serious, as she suspected the bullet had damaged important blood vessels. The leg wound was painful but appeared to have missed major arteries. The head graze was superficial but had bled heavily. Through the thin walls, she could hear her captors monitoring radio communications and discussing the increasing American military presence in their area. Helicopter activity had intensified throughout the day, and there were reports of house-to-house searches beginning in nearby neighborhoods. Sarah realized that time was running out. Either rescue would come soon, or her captors might decide to eliminate the evidence of their operation. The sound of distant explosions punctuated the night, reminding Sarah that Fallujah remained an active combat zone where life and death decisions were made in split seconds. She thought about her patients back at the clinic, wondering who would care for them now that the medical team had been attacked. The thought of those families suffering without medical care because of what had happened to her team filled her with a determination to survive that overcame even her physical pain. As she lay in the darkness, Sarah began to formulate a mental map of the house and surrounding area, storing every detail that might prove useful if an escape opportunity presented itself. She knew that her medical knowledge might be the only thing keeping her alive, as her captors had shown interest in her supplies and credentials. If she could convince them that she was more valuable alive than dead, she might buy enough time for rescue to arrive. Dawn brought new urgency to the safe house as Sarah's captors received radio communications that clearly agitated them. The sound of approaching military vehicles could be heard in the distance, growing steadily closer as American forces expanded their search patterns. Through the cracked window of her small room, Sarah could see smoke rising from several locations across the city, indicating that the military response to their capture was escalating rapidly. One of her captors, a younger man who spoke better English than the others, entered her room with obvious concern etched on his face. He explained that they needed to move immediately because the Americans were conducting systematic searches of every building in a widening radius around the attack site. Sarah's heart leaped at this news, but she was careful not to show any reaction that might anger her captors or make them more desperate. Ahmad was brought to her room, and she was relieved to see that while he was clearly in pain from his injuries, he remained alert and capable of walking. He whispered urgently that he had overheard arguments among their captors about whether to kill their prisoners before fleeing or attempt to transport them to a more secure location outside the city. The younger English-speaking captor seemed to favor keeping them alive, possibly for their propaganda value, while others viewed them as dangerous liabilities. The decision was made to move deeper into the city, toward an area that had seen less American military activity. Sarah and Ahmad were blindfolded and loaded into the back of a small truck, along with their captors' weapons and supplies. The journey was terrifying as they bounced through streets while listening to radio chatter about military checkpoints and patrol movements. Every stop made Sarah wonder if this would be where their captors decided to eliminate them. The new location was a partially collapsed apartment building that had clearly been abandoned since the early days of the conflict. Families had left, behind personal belongings in their haste to escape, creating an eerie museum of interrupted lives. Sarah was placed in what had once been a child's bedroom, complete with cartoon characters painted on walls now marked by bullet holes and shrapnel damage. Her medical condition was deteriorating steadily. The shoulder wound had become infected, causing fever and weakness that made it difficult to think clearly. The captors had provided minimal food and water, apparently viewing basic sustenance as unnecessary for prisoners they might execute at any moment. Sarah knew that without proper medical treatment, infection could kill her even if she managed to avoid execution. The situation took an unexpected turn when one of her captors was brought to her with a severe cut on his arm from shrapnel during their movement through the city. Despite being a prisoner, Sarah's medical instincts took over, and she convinced them to let her treat the wound using supplies from her medical bag. As she worked, cleaning and bandaging the injury with professional competence, she noticed a shift in how some of her captors viewed her. The man she treated began speaking to the others about her value as a doctor, arguing that killing someone with her medical skills was wasteful when their own fighters frequently needed treatment for combat injuries. This practical argument seemed to resonate more than humanitarian appeals had, and Sarah began to hope that her medical knowledge might indeed be her salvation. However, the respite was temporary. Radio communications throughout the second day brought increasingly alarming news for her captors. American forces had identified the apartment building as a possible hiding place and were preparing to conduct a detailed search of the area. The stress of being hunted was clearly affecting her captors' decision-making, and some began advocating for immediate execution of the prisoners to eliminate evidence. The debate grew heated as military helicopters circled overhead, their rotors creating a constant reminder of the approaching danger. Sarah could hear vehicles moving through nearby streets and occasional bursts of gunfire as American patrols encountered resistance. The net was closing, but whether rescue would arrive before her captor's patience ran out remained terrifyingly uncertain. That evening, the English-speaking captor brought disturbing news. Intelligence sources had reported that American forces were planning a major operation to clear the entire neighborhood building by building. The captors had decided to make one final move to a location outside the city where they could wait out the current military surge. However, transporting prisoners during such an operation would be extremely dangerous for everyone involved. Sarah realized that this move could be her death sentence, as the captors might decide it was easier to kill her and Ahmad, rather than risk the complications of moving them through active combat zones. She spent the night listening to the sounds of battle drawing closer, knowing that each explosion and burst of gunfire might be bringing either salvation or doom. The pain from her infected wounds made it difficult to sleep, but she forced herself to stay alert for any opportunity that might present itself. As the second night wore on, she could hear intense discussions among her captors about their dwindling options. The American military response had been faster and more comprehensive than they had anticipated, leaving them with few safe routes out of the city. Sarah sensed that a critical decision point was approaching, one that would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise or became another casualty in the brutal arithmetic of urban warfare. The third day dawned with the ominous sound of tanks moving through the streets below. Sarah's fever had worsened overnight, and she drifted in and out of consciousness as her body fought the spreading infection from her untreated wounds. Ahmad had been moved to a different room, and she had not seen him since the previous evening, leaving her to wonder about his condition and whether he was even still alive. Through her delirium, Sarah became aware of heated arguments taking place throughout the building. The stress of being trapped by the advancing American forces was causing fractures within the group, holding them captive. Some wanted to surrender and use their prisoners as bargaining chips, while others insisted that fighting to the death was preferable to capture. The disagreement was becoming violent, with shouting matches and the sound of weapons being brandished. The English-speaking captor, who had shown her some measure of consideration, entered her room with obvious distress. He explained that the situation had become desperate, as American forces had surrounded the building and were demanding surrender within 1 hour. Some of his companions wanted to execute the prisoners immediately, while others hoped to use them as human shields during a breakout attempt. He seemed genuinely conflicted about what course of action would offer the best chance of survival for everyone involved. Sarah summoned what strength she had left to make one final appeal. For her life and Ahmad's, she emphasized her value as a medical professional who had come to Iraq solely to help civilians, including many who shared the same faith and culture as her captors. She pointed out that killing humanitarian workers would only bring more military pressure on their community and make it harder for civilians to receive medical care in the future. Her words seemed to have some impact, particularly when she mentioned specific patients she had treated and families she had helped. The captor admitted that his own sister had received treatment at their clinic for complications during childbirth, and that Sarah's team had quite likely saved both mother and child. This personal connection appeared to weigh heavily on his conscience as he contemplated the decision facing the group. The deadline imposed by the American forces was approaching rapidly, and Sarah could hear military personnel using loudspeakers to demand surrender while promising safe treatment for anyone who gave up peacefully. The psychological pressure was intense, and she could sense that her captors were reaching a breaking point where desperation might override rational thinking. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from multiple locations within the building, as some of the captors decided to fight rather than surrender. The sound was deafening in the confined space, and Sarah pressed herself against the floor as bullets punched through walls around her. Through the chaos, she heard American voices shouting tactical commands and coordinating their assault on the building. The battle was brief but intense. Sarah heard the distinctive sound of military boots on stairs as American forces fought their way through the building room by room. Her door was kicked open by a figure in full combat gear, who quickly identified her as a hostage rather than a threat. The relief she felt upon seeing the American flag patch on his uniform was overwhelming, but she was too weak from blood loss and infection to fully appreciate her rescue. The soldier, a Navy SEAL whose face was obscured by tactical gear, immediately began assessing her medical condition while calling for a corpsman over his radio. His training was evident as he quickly identified the severity of her wounds and began emergency treatment to stabilize her condition. Sarah tried to tell him about Ahmad, but her voice was weak and the continuing gunfire made communication difficult. Within minutes, additional personnel arrived with medical equipment and began more comprehensive treatment of her injuries. The shoulder wound required immediate attention to stop internal bleeding that had continued for nearly 3 days. The infected areas were cleaned and treated with antibiotics that her body desperately needed. For the first time since her capture, Sarah began to believe she might actually survive this ordeal. Ahmad was found in an adjacent room, unconscious but alive. His injuries were less severe than Sarah's, but he had also suffered from lack of medical treatment and inadequate food and water. The medical team worked on both patients simultaneously while other SEAL team members secured the building and searched for additional hostages or threats. The extraction from the building required careful coordination due to ongoing resistance from fighters in nearby structures. Sarah was placed on a stretcher and carried through corridors marked by battle damage, while SEAL team members provided security. The professionalism and efficiency of the rescue operation impressed her even through her medical haze, as every movement seemed precisely calculated to minimize risk to the rescued hostages. The helicopter ride to the medical facility was a blur of pain medication and emergency medical procedures performed by skilled corpsmen. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, but she was lucid enough to understand that she was finally safe and receiving the medical care that could save her life. The infected wounds that had threatened to kill her were being properly treated, and intravenous fluids were helping to restore her strength. As the helicopter approached the military medical facility, Sarah reflected on the events of the past 3 days with a mixture of trauma and gratitude. The experience had shown her both the worst and best of human nature, the cruelty of those who had captured and threatened her, but also the bravery of those who had risked their lives to rescue complete strangers in a foreign land. The military hospital where Sarah was taken represented a stark contrast to the chaos and danger she had endured for the past 3 days. Clean white walls, the steady beeping of medical monitors, and the professional calm of military medical personnel created an environment where healing could finally begin. The chief surgeon, Colonel Rebecca Thompson, personally oversaw Sarah's treatment, ensuring that every aspect of her care met the highest standards. The extent of Sarah's injuries became fully apparent once comprehensive medical examinations were completed. Beyond the obvious gunshot wounds, she had developed a serious infection that had begun spreading through her bloodstream. Without the rescue and immediate medical intervention, doctors estimated she would have died within 24 hours. The realization of how close she had come to death was both sobering and overwhelming. Ahmad was recovering in a nearby room, and Sarah was relieved to learn that his injuries, while painful, were not life-threatening. He had suffered a concussion and several broken ribs in addition to the gunshot wound, but his overall prognosis was positive. The translator had become more than just a colleague during their shared ordeal. He had become a friend whose survival mattered deeply to her. During her recovery, Sarah met some of the SEAL team members who had participated in her rescue. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, the team leader, visited her room to check on her progress and provide details about the operation that had saved her life. He explained that the rescue had required careful intelligence gathering and coordination between multiple military units to succeed without additional casualties. The planning phase had begun within hours of the initial attack on her medical convoy. Military intelligence had worked around the clock to identify possible locations where hostages might be held, using everything from satellite imagery to human intelligence sources within the city. The operation had been complicated by the urban environment and the need to rescue hostages without triggering their execution by desperate captors. Rodriguez revealed that the SEAL team had actually located Sarah and Ahmad 12 hours before the actual rescue, but had waited for the optimal moment to strike when the risk to the hostages was minimized. The timing had been critical, as intelligence indicated that some of the captors were advocating for immediate execution of their prisoners to eliminate evidence before escaping the city. The successful rescue had required split-second timing and precise execution under extremely dangerous conditions. Multiple entry points had been used simultaneously to prevent the captors from retreating to rooms where they held hostages. Flashbang grenades had been employed to disorient the captors while SEAL team members moved to secure Sarah and Ahmad before they could be harmed. Sarah learned that her rescue had been part of a larger military operation to clear Fallujah of insurgent forces who had been targeting humanitarian workers and civilian infrastructure. The attack on her medical team had been one of several incidents that prompted military commanders to take decisive action against those responsible for terrorizing civilians and aid workers. The international attention generated by her rescue highlighted The dangers faced by humanitarian workers in conflict zones around the world. News organizations covered the story extensively, focusing on both the heroism of the military personnel who had saved her and the ongoing need for medical assistance in war-torn regions like Iraq. During her recovery, Sarah received visits from military chaplains, psychologists, and other support personnel trained to help trauma victims process their experiences. The psychological impact of her ordeal was significant, manifesting in nightmares, anxiety attacks, and difficulty trusting new situations. Professional counseling became an essential part of her healing process alongside the physical rehabilitation. Letters and messages of support arrived from around the world as news of her rescue spread. Fellow medical professionals, military families, and complete strangers expressed their admiration for her courage and their gratitude to the military personnel who had saved her. The outpouring of support helped counterbalance the trauma by reminding her that most people valued compassion and self-sacrifice over violence and hatred. Her family arrived from Phoenix within 48 hours of her rescue, having endured 3 days of not knowing whether she was alive or dead. The reunion was emotional and profound, strengthening Sarah's determination to fully recover and continue her humanitarian work, despite the risks involved. Her parents had aged visibly during the ordeal, but their relief at her survival was evident in every gesture and word. The medical team that had been with Sarah during the attack had suffered varying fates. Dr. Morrison had survived the initial ambush and managed to escape with 2 other team members, though they had been forced to abandon their humanitarian mission in Fallujah. One team member had been killed in the attack, making Sarah acutely aware of how fortunate she had been to survive her injuries and captivity. As her physical condition stabilized, Sarah began thinking about her future and whether she would continue working in dangerous areas where humanitarian assistance was desperately needed. The experience had certainly changed her perspective on risk assessment and security protocols, but it had not diminished her commitment to helping people who had few other options for medical care. The recovery process was slow and sometimes frustrating, as her body needed time to heal from both the physical trauma and the psychological stress of her ordeal. Physical therapy helped restore strength and mobility to her injured shoulder and leg, while counseling sessions addressed the mental and emotional aspects of her recovery. Each small improvement felt like a victory over those who had tried to break her spirit through violence and intimidation. 6 months after her rescue, Sarah stood before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C., testifying about the challenges facing humanitarian workers in conflict zones and the importance of military support for civilian assistance operations. Her recovery had been remarkable, though she still bore physical scars from her wounds and emotional scars from her 3 days in captivity. The experience had transformed her from a dedicated nurse into an advocate for both humanitarian workers and military personnel who risk their lives to protect others. The testimony was part of broader hearings examining how to better protect civilian aid workers while ensuring that humanitarian assistance could continue reaching those who needed it most. Sarah's first-hand account provided lawmakers with vivid details about the realities of working in combat zones and the complex security considerations that medical teams faced every day. Her relationship with the SEAL team that had rescued her had evolved into lasting friendships built on mutual respect and shared understanding of life and death situations. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had stayed in contact throughout her recovery, and several team members had attended her medical school graduation ceremony, where she received recognition for her service in Iraq. The bonds forged during crisis had created connections that transcended military and civilian boundaries. Ahmad had also recovered fully from his injuries and had successfully immigrated to the United States with his family through a special visa program for Iraqi citizens who had assisted American humanitarian efforts. He now worked as a translator for refugee resettlement programs, helping other Iraqi families adapt to life in America. Their shared ordeal had created a lifelong friendship that bridged cultural and linguistic differences. The medical clinic in Fallujah where Sarah had worked was eventually rebuilt and expanded, serving as a testament to the resilience of humanitarian efforts in the face of violence and intimidation. Local medical staff, trained by international teams like the one Sarah had been part of, now provided most of the day-to-day care for residents. The facility had become a symbol of hope and healing in a community that had endured tremendous suffering. Sarah's decision about returning to international humanitarian work had been difficult and deeply personal. While her experience in Iraq had not diminished her commitment to helping others, it had made her more aware of the risks and the need for better security protocols. She eventually chose to focus on training other medical volunteers, sharing both her clinical expertise and hard-won knowledge about staying safe in dangerous environments. The psychological impact of her ordeal continued to influence her daily life in ways both subtle and profound. Crowded places sometimes triggered anxiety. Sudden loud noises could cause flashbacks, and she remained hyper-vigilant about potential threats in her environment. However, professional counseling and the support of family and friends had helped her develop coping mechanisms that allowed her to function effectively and find meaning in her experiences. Her story had been featured in numerous articles, documentaries, and speaking engagements where she emphasized the importance of supporting both humanitarian workers and military personnel who serve in dangerous locations. She became particularly passionate about advocating for better mental health resources for trauma survivors, drawing from her own recovery process to help others navigate similar challenges. The captors who had held her prisoner had met various fates following her rescue. Some had been killed during the military operation that freed her, while others had been captured and faced trial for kidnapping and terrorism charges. The English-speaking captor who had shown her some consideration had surrendered during the rescue and received a reduced sentence in exchange for providing intelligence about other insurgent operations in the region. Years after the incident, Sarah established a foundation dedicated to providing medical training and security education for humanitarian workers deployed to conflict zones. The organization worked closely with military advisors to develop protocols that could reduce risks while maintaining the effectiveness of civilian assistance programs. Her goal was to ensure that other medical volunteers could serve safely and effectively without enduring the trauma she had experienced. The anniversary of her rescue became an annual occasion for reflecting on the lessons learned from her experience and honoring both the humanitarian workers who continued serving in dangerous locations and the military personnel who protected them. Sarah often spoke at military bases and medical schools, sharing her story as an example of how ordinary people could demonstrate extraordinary courage when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. Her life had been forever changed by 3 days in Fallujah, but she had chosen to transform trauma into purpose and fear into determination. The scars on her shoulder and leg served as daily reminders of how close she had come to death, but also of the remarkable human capacity for survival, healing, and growth. Most importantly, her experience had reinforced her belief that even in the darkest circumstances, there were always people willing to risk everything to help complete strangers. The final chapter of Sarah's story was still being written, but it was clear that her legacy would be measured not just by her survival, but by how she had used that survival to make the world safer for others who chose to serve humanity in its most dangerous and desperate places. Her rescue by the SEALs had given her a second chance at life, and she was determined to make that chance count for something greater than herself.